Welcome to Sunday School for January 10th, 2021. I'm glad to have you with us. Today we're going to be continuing our survey of the Old Testament. Last week we looked at the book of Leviticus, and this week we're moving on to the next book in the Bible, the fourth book of the Bible, the book of Numbers. So that's what we'll be jumping into today. So happy that you can join us. Let's get right into it. Alright, well, we're going to jump around in the book of Numbers a little bit this week, and the first place we're going to go is the very beginning. So if you have your Bibles and you want to have them open, you can turn to Numbers chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. And this is where the name Numbers comes when we read this passage. This is God's Word. Let's read it. The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first day of the second month in the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, "Take a census of all the congregation of the people of Israel, by clans, by fathers' houses, according to the number of names, every male, head by head, from 20 years old and upward, all in Israel who are able to go to war. You and Aaron shall list them, company by company." Okay, so what we see here is we see that God is commanding that Moses and Aaron number the people of Israel. Particularly, they number the fighting men, the men who would be eligible to fight in battle in the people of Israel. And the rest of Numbers, or the rest of that section of Numbers, is a list of the different tribes of Israel with their numbers. They list all 12 tribes, and he even lists where they're going to be. And I'm going to put on the screen now just a quick little diagram of what this would have looked like, because I want you to be able to see how the Lord arranged His people, how they would march. This is how they would march, and also how they would camp as they traveled through the wilderness and toward the Promised Land. So as you can see, they're arranged in a little bit of a circle with the tabernacle in the middle, the Levites around the tabernacle on all four sides, and then three tribes to each side. And there's a couple of things that I want you to see just from this section. One is that God knows that His people are going to be engaged in battle. This is not a pleasure cruise or a walkabout or a leisurely stroll through the wilderness. God is preparing His people for hard times ahead. And that's a good lesson for us to remember, is that the Christian life is not one where it's not a cruise, but it's a battleship. We have an enemy, and we should be prepared to take on that enemy. And God is preparing us for that. He's even arranging His people here to take the fight to the world, and we are to take the fight to the sin in our own hearts and the sin in the world. So that's one of the first things you can see. The second thing I want you to notice is that God is in the middle of His people. His people are in the wilderness in tents, and that's what a lot of Numbers is Israel wandering through the wilderness. But God is in the midst of His people. They have to live in a tent for a long time, and God lives in a tent. He is located in a specific place. He has a tent. And in many ways, this is kind of a precursor to Jesus Christ, because just as God dwelt in a tent that they called the tabernacle, and His people dwelt in a tent, it says in John chapter 1 that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And that word dwelt that's used there in John chapter 1 is the word tabernacle. It's the verb form of the word tabernacle. In other words, the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. So this is a sign that we need to recognize even now in the Old Testament, that God is preparing His people, that He would be in their midst, and that He would dwell with them. And this, in many ways, this foreshadows the incarnation of Christ. I also want you to notice that the servants of God are separating the people of God from the tabernacle. And that's another important thing that we should recognize, is that God is preserving His own holiness here. And He's saying, look, I dwell among you. Yes, I am immanent. I am close to you, but I am also transcendent. And you should be careful in approaching me. And so the people that are in between the people and God are the Levites. In other words, the priests stand in between, and that's one of the roles that Christ fulfills. He's our prophet, our priest, and our king. He's our priest. He stands before us. He goes before us before God. We don't go before God. We only go before God in His name. He intercedes on our behalf. The last thing I want you to see, and you may not have noticed that in the diagram, and maybe I'll put it back up here when we get to the editing room, but I want you to see what tribe is in the lead. All right, what tribe is in the lead? And that's the tribe that is leading the eastern side of the encampment of Israel, and that is Judah. And yet again, this is pointing us to Christ, because Christ comes from the tribe of Judah, and Judah is in the lead. It's called the vanguard in battle. In other words, the tip of the spear, where the fighting is the fiercest. This is where God places the tribe of Judah, and yet again, that is another kind of shadow of the fact that we need one to come and fight for us, and that He will come from the tribe of Judah, and He will lead His people victoriously into battle. So just a couple of things you can see from that passage about God numbering His people. Let's move on a little bit further in Numbers to a narrative account that's pretty important as far as why Israel was wandering and the Promised Land in general. Flip forward just a little bit to Numbers chapter 13, and I want to read a few verses from Numbers chapter 13. I'm going to read verses 1 and 2, and then also verses 25 through 28. This is the story of when Israel comes to the precipice of the Promised Land, and they spy it out. And this is the sending of the spies. This is Numbers chapter 13. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers, you shall send a man, every one a chief among them." Now we're going to fast forward to verses 25 to 28. This is when they come back. At the end of 40 days, they returned from spying out the land. And they came to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation, and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told them, "We came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large." Okay, well that was Numbers 13, 1 and 2, and then 25 and 28. And what happens here, I'm going to read the whole passage, but what happens here is that for 40 days, Israel sends 12 spies out into the Promised Land, one from each tribe, to kind of get to do some reconnaissance and to get an idea of who they're going to be up against when they attempt to take over this land. And what the land is like as well. Remember, these people had not been to the Promised Land. They had lived their entire lives in captivity in Egypt as slaves. They didn't know anything about where their ancestors were from or where Abraham had been. So they send these spies, and 2 spies come back and say, "The land is good, the people are strong, the cities are fortified, but the Lord is with us and we'll be victorious. We can defeat them." The other 10 spies say, "Those people are stronger than us, and there's no way we can win." So you've got 10 naysayers, negative Nellies, and you've got 2 positive Pollies. But that's not what's happening here. And when we read this passage, it's easy to say, look how Joshua and Caleb had faith. And we tend to, when we say that, sometimes we can think in our mind that it means that they ignored reality and instead just trusted in God blindly. But that's not what's happening here. Joshua and Caleb both agree that the land is good, the people are strong, and the cities are well fortified. But what Joshua and Caleb also both say is that the Lord is with us, and the Lord will deliver them into their hands. And we see that when Israel does come into the Promised Land many years later, after the wilderness wandering, we'll see that despite their powerful cities and their strong soldiers, that the Lord does deliver those people into the hand of the Israelites. So it wasn't their faith. What I want you to see here is their faith was not a faith that ignored facts, right? They recognized the facts. It's just that they recognized one more fact that the 10 naysayers did not want to recognize, and that was that they had the Lord on their side. And that was the game changer in this instance. If we're not careful, we are often like the 10 spies. And what I mean by that is that we see things only from a worldly perspective. They said, well, these people are strong, there's no way we can win. And oftentimes that's how we think about our faith, if we're honest. We look at someone who is struggling. I remember a student said to me one time, that girl shouldn't be coming to youth group. She does this, this, and this on the weekends. And I thought to myself, where else would we want her to be? That's what I told him too. I said, where else would we want her to be except in youth group? You know, someone you might be tempted to think things like, well, that person's never going to change. They're always going to be like this or like that. And what that reveals is a lack of faith and a lack of ability in God to change people's lives and to make people new creations. And if we're honest with ourselves, that's a problem that many of us have. We don't believe that God is strong enough to change our circumstances. We look at our circumstances and say that's what defines our situation, instead of saying that God is, rules and overrules over our circumstances. So again, having faith in God is not saying everything is fine when it's not. Because again, Joshua and Caleb said, look, these are strong cities and good soldiers that we're going to be up against. It's not that. It's not ignoring reality. Instead, it's recognizing reality, but also recognizing that we're trusting in one who rules and overrules even over our situations. Okay, let's flip forward just one chapter to Numbers 14 and see how the people respond to this report. This is Numbers 14, 1-4. Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to one another, let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Now this is a pretty crazy situation, because the people of Israel who saw the plagues, who walked across the dry land in the Red Sea, these people, okay, they say, who were slaves for hundreds of years in Egypt, they say, no, we better go back to Egypt. I wish we would have died in Egypt. Now, that sounds ridiculous. And it is in some ways ridiculous. But this teaches us a couple of things. The first thing it teaches us is, it was one thing for God to take his people out of Egypt, but it's a whole other thing to take Egypt out of his people. In other words, even though they've been freed from slavery, they still had the heart of a slave. So much so that when they come up against resistance, they would rather live as slaves than live as free people. And that's one of the truths about freedom, is that freedom is harder than slavery. Slavery is easy, and I don't mean it's easy in that it's leisurely. What I mean is that you're told what to do and you do it or you die, right? There's no, that's it. That's the essence of slavery. These people were slaves, and yet they say we'd rather go back because now they're having to stand on their own 2 feet. And they're also having to trust God. They don't want to trust God, and they don't want to stand on their own 2 feet. And so therefore, they even say, well, I wish we could go back. And this is not the first time. This happens over and over and over again. In fact, God says this is the 10th time that they've grumbled against him there. So that's an important thing to recognize, is that sometimes we think, well, if I had seen the miracles, I'd have always believed. But these very people who saw the plagues, who walked across the Red Sea, they were ready to go back to Egypt and throw themselves back in chains because they faced some resistance, because they did not believe that God would deliver them. They continually grumbled against God. And that's a great lesson for us, because I would say one of the things that typifies our society and our culture and the culture in Montgomery is that we're very good at grumbling. We're very good at complaining. We're very good at finding things that are wrong. We're very good at listing all the ways in which our life is hard and everyone else has it easier than us. We're a lot like these Egyptians. We're just like the 10 spies who had no faith in God. In a lot of ways, we're just like the people. We are ready to grumble against God. Instead of seeing all the things that God has done for us, we look at all the things that we're worried he won't do for us. So there's a lesson for us in that as well. Let's move on to the next section. All right, the last section of Numbers 14 that I want you to look at is in verse 26. 26 through 33. Let's read this. It's a little bit of a longer section, but let's read it. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, how long shall this wicked congregation grumble against me? I have heard the grumblings of the people of Israel, which they grumble against me. Say to them, as I live, declares the Lord, what you have said in my hearing I will do to you. Your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness, and all of your number, listed in the census from 20 years old and upward, who have grumbled against me, not one shall come into the land where I swore that I would make you dwell, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joseph the son of Nun. But your little ones, who you said will become a prey, I will bring in, and they shall know the land that you have rejected. But as for you, your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness, And your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years, and shall suffer for your faithlessness, until the last of your dead bodies lies in the wilderness. All right, so this passage is pretty important because this is God's response to the people's grumbling and their refusal to believe and to go and to take the land that he was going to give to them, is he sends them into the wandering. Now, when I was a kid and I heard that Israel wandered for 40 years in the desert, I thought, or in the wilderness, what I thought to myself was, man, well, I didn't think this as a kid because this didn't exist, but I thought, man, they really needed a map, or they needed some GPS, but that's not what's happening here. Instead, God is sending Israel not like to wander around and try to find something. He's sending them away into the wilderness to wander because they refused to do what he asked them to do, to go and to refuse to believe in him and to trust in him and to go and to take the promised land. So this is by design. The people of Israel were sure that they would be defeated because they thought in a worldly way. They said, well, they were sure they would be defeated. They did not trust God's goodness, and they thought that the enemy was going to hunt down their women and their little children, and they were going to become his prey. And what God says is, no, your lack of trust, your lack of faith, this 10th time that you've grumbled against me, look, I'm going to fulfill all my promises, but I'm going to fulfill all my promises to the people that you thought would be prey. Those children and those that you thought would be run down, no, they will be the ones to enter the promised land. And you will never enter the promised land. You will die in the wilderness. You will not see the promise, this generation. And so the people of God did not wander the wilderness because they were lost. They wandered the wilderness because they did not trust in God. And it was a judgment God gives upon the people. But there's also, even in God's judgment, there's also his faithfulness. Because he says, no, my promise is good. But now the people that you thought that I was such a bad God that I would let your children be run down by the Amalekites and the Canaanites or whoever. But no, your children will be the ones who go into the promised land. You who lacked faith will never go. So there's still grace even in God's judgment on these people. And I just want you to see that God is recognizing that he is not going to be mocked and he's not going to be grumbled against, and he is a holy God. And these people took for granted all the different great blessings that he had given them, either whether it's manna from heaven or water from the rock or crossing through the Red Sea or the plagues that freed them. All these things that God has done for them, and they've taken it for granted. And they've said, no, God is a mean God, and now he's going to let these people, now that we've come all the way to the promised land, to the threshold of the promised land, now God's going to let these people kill us and kill all of our wives and children. And God says, how could you not believe in me? Well, you won't believe in me? Well, then I will make your children believe in me. And he punishes this generation, but he also is faithful in fulfilling his promises to the next generation and also to Caleb and Joshua. And that's maybe the last thing I want you to see, is that Caleb and Joshua were faithful to God when it was not popular and would have been easy to go along with everyone else. And instead, they said what they actually believed, and God rewarded them. And that's the last thing I want you to hear, is that when you make a stand for God, when you do things, when you don't go with the flow, and when you pursue holiness instead of pursuing approval from the world, when you seek after God's ways and God's words instead of seeking after the world's ways and the world's words, when you do that, God recognizes that. He does not miss it. Maybe no one else recognizes it, but he recognizes it. And that would be a sincere encouragement to you. Okay, well, what are our takeaways for this lesson? The first one is this, is that God dwells with his people. That as the people suffered, so God was with them. He dwelt in the tent, in the tabernacle with his people. And that is always true. Anytime we face any hardship, is that God goes before us and with us and behind us in that hardship. The second thing is faith is not lying about the circumstances and acting like they're fine when they're not fine. Instead, faith is recognizing all of the hard circumstances, but also recognizing that God will be with us. Faith is recognizing God's presence with us even when our circumstances are difficult. Another lesson or takeaway that we can have here is that our brokenness doesn't come from our surroundings. It wasn't Egypt that made the people doubt God's faith. It wasn't Egypt that made people doubt God's goodness. But no, our brokenness comes from inside. These people are 2 years removed from Egypt, and yet they still doubt God's goodness, because that's where our brokenness comes from. It's not society or culture, the internet, social media. Those are not the things that cause us to stumble and sin. No, all the wickedness that we need, all the wickedness that there is, and the seeds for every sin lie in our hearts. The last takeaway is that God is faithful to his promises. That even when his people are grumbling against him, even when he judges them and punishes them and disciplines them for the way in which they grumble against him, he still is faithful to his people, and all of his promises are true, and we can trust in them. He always recognizes it when we show faith in him. He never misses it. So those are our takeaways for today. Thanks for joining us. Hopefully you can join us on Sunday in the Frith, 9:45 to 10:30. We'd love to have you there. If not, hopefully this is a benefit to you.